So we're here with James Felton. I've been working with you for the last 2 weeks, cataloging your library, which I've been calling the archive. But it's anything but archival because obviously we're packing it up. And we don't know what's going to happen to the books necessarily. Like, we have an idea of like who's taking them, where they're going, but once they're in the boxes, we don't really know when they'll be taken out again.
I think one of the big benefits of cataloging is that it will increase the likelihood that the boxed up books will reappear.
Yeah, that's true.
As opposed to just shoving them into boxes without labels, without any organization, and ending up where they just simply gather dust, get forgotten, which will be a shame. But at least through your help with cataloging, we have a spreadsheet that whoever's in possession of the books can go, I see. Someone wants one of these. I have it in box 38.
That's right.
Won't take me long to find.
Our spreadsheet is really good. Well, you created the template. It's been really easy to fill it out.
Right.
I guess... Yeah, so for me, I'm interested in what the library that you've amassed says about you. I've been percolating on this project called the Library as Tarot for a while now, and I've always wanted to catalog somebody's library and then to do a reading. And I considered doing this with one other person, and then I just realized cataloging's a lot of work. So I never actually got around to going to their office and like even beginning the process. So It was very great timing when I heard that Rolf was looking for somebody to help catalog, and I didn't know anything about you. And now I feel like, over the last couple of weeks, we've learned a lot about one another. And I think specifically going through the books and hearing you talk about, the writers that you met either in person or that you just met through their writings. I think that's been really, really interesting. So before, I wanted to read this Carl Jung quote, but before we do that, is there anything, that comes to your mind as because I guess we have about a week left to wrap up the cataloging.
The cataloging, you coming into my life at this very late stage of divesting myself of all of the books is such a godsend. I want to say thank you so much for doing it, because of all cataloging, the most onerous would be cataloging little magazines, periodicals, because it's mind-numbing. Volume 3, number 4. Do I have that, or was it volume 4, number 2? Am I dyslexic? What is going on here? And it's a big, big challenge. And a lot of booksellers, from what I can recall in my heady days of buying and collecting, they tend to avoid dealing with periodicals for that very reason, that it is mind-numbing if they had to put that online. And for them to put it in a catalog, even a digital catalog, that they would then circulate with or to their client base. It's really, really onerous work. Of all of the cataloging that one could do in terms of literature, periodicals would certainly be the most challenging, most mind-numbing, I would say, not challenging necessarily.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I haven't found it mind-numbing at all. I think...
Good.
Well, it's been very cool. I do think technology helps a lot here, but also, because we're packing them up, and, you've been, very generous letting me keep, like, some of the extra copies, but there's some of them where there are no extra copies, and so I've just had my phone with me, and I've been able to take photos of all of the, little magazines and things like that, and I found that it doesn't break up the tedium. It doesn't feel tedious at all, because if anything, it helps me to, create a smidge of materiality with, an object that is actually becoming digital. It's becoming a line on the spreadsheet. So I found it very fun. But yesterday at some point, I needed your help because all of the Roman numerals were just blurring in my mind. And Actually, I was a bit embarrassed because, I'm fine with Roman numerals, and I was worried. I was like, oh, is James going to think that millennials just don't know how to read Roman numerals? But yeah, I would say that was probably the most challenging days, like having I don't even remember which magazine I was going through.
Well, if you had a number like 29, so you've got XX, 1X, you can so easily think perhaps, was that 39? Was it XXX? How many X's were at the beginning? And it gets very confusing.
It does.
Understandably.
What was it? Let me check. Also, we got very far yesterday. Mm-hmm. Was it Quarry or Queen's Quarterly?
Queen's Quarterly were the ones that's the one that started in the 1950s.
Yeah.
And only went by Roman numerals in terms of their various issues. Yeah.
But so I'm finding it really fun. I think it's good that our lives have like intersected in this way.
I find that intriguing as well.
Yeah, it's very cool. And I think it's a really good segue to the idea of tarot, because the reason I'm so interested in the library as tarot is because the idea of tarot is not necessarily that it's divinatory. The origins of tarot are actually, they're mostly card games. So, so people are playing these different card games. And I think, too, books, they're like, whether you're collecting, you're collecting, like, different periodicals, you're amassing, different types of, like, Canadian lit, like, volumes. So I think that's a bit of a game, too, when you're, trying to find a complete run of something, or trying to, or like when you mentioned that you went to PK Page's house and kind of the conditions, like the negotiation for taking over her personal library, which we can talk about.
Certainly.
I think is very much like a game. And at the same time, it is, there's a school of thought that looks at tarot more as a way to understand the self. And so that's the Carl Jung, Ina Sametsky school of thought. And so I wanted to read, just to kind of ground ourselves, I wanted to read this 1933 quote from Carl Jung, and then we can just start talking about you and hear more from you and a bit less from me. So in 1933, Carl Jung said, "The original cards of the tarot consist of the ordinary cards, the king, the queen, the knight, the ace, etc. Only the figures are somewhat different. And besides, there are 21 additional cards upon which are symbols or pictures of symbolical situations. For example, the symbol of the sun, or the symbol of the man hung up by the feet, or the tower struck by lightning, or the wheel of fortune, and so on. Those are sort of archetypal ideas of a differentiated nature, which mingle with the ordinary constituents of the flow of the unconscious, and therefore it is applicable for an intuitive method that has the purpose of understanding the flow of life, possibly even predicting future events, at all events lending itself to the reading of the conditions of the present moment." So obviously your library is quite extensive. Mm-hmm. We spent a lot of our time together on the Canadian periodicals. And so how does your personal library writ large, so not just the periodicals, although I do get the sense that the periodicals are the ones that are like the closest and dearest to your heart. And I want to know, how does your personal library, which, you built for yourself as a reader, a collector, a friend of the writers and publishers and editors, as well as, as potentially commercial in nature because you had wanted to sell some of these books. How does that mingle with the flow of your unconscious? Are there patterns in your library, for example, that align with certain life events of yours? And then, what do you think?
I think that when it comes to book collectors, or perhaps anyone who is an avid collector, but since I'm familiar with books, I'll stay in that little arena. People are either what I would call butterflies or miners. So, to use those two metaphors, a miner is someone who drills deep and who keeps looking for that thick vein of gold. And so you have collectors who are into building a library of one particular poet, or perhaps a group of poets who share some sort of an affinity. So, for instance, Al Purdy was a very big Canadian poet, and my good friend Tom Woods is an avid Al Purdy collector.
Okay.
I'll talk more about Tom a little later if you'd like. Then there are those who are butterflies. And a butterfly flits from flower to flower, tasting this one, then that one, then that one. And when I first started collecting, I was a butterfly. I wanted to amass any and every piece of candlelit imaginable, which in itself was such a huge undertaking. And today, if you look at my poetry collection, you didn't have a chance to see that, but I had an extensive run of publications from Fiddlehead Poetry Books. This is an organization that was out in the Maritimes, started by a wonderful academic and poet, Fred, and I've just gone blank on his last name, it'll come to me in a second, who created and founded this press and was publishing poets at a rate that was unmatched in Canada. This was predominantly in the 70s, but that press is still going to this day. Anyway, that would be me in the early days as a butterfly, where I wanted to try and find every last Fiddlehead poetry book imaginable, regardless of the merit and the quality of the writing.
Yeah.
I wanted to see if I could complete that series, if you wish. I did that also with Ryerson Press. In the very beginnings, Ryerson, still going, I think they're now McGraw-Hill Ryerson, through amalgamations. They ran a chapbook series that ran into the 200s, where they would feature a single poet with a handful of poems. And do you know what a chapbook is?
Could you describe it for us?
It is very small, with a limited number of poems, perhaps 5,
Okay.
maybe 10, and that would be really pushing it. And it's designed as a kind of a appetizer for the reader to say, this is what this particular poet's capable of producing and creating. That was a run that I wanted to complete.
Okay.
So you can already see some trends in terms of my personality. I'm a completionist.
Yeah.
And that really applied to the periodicals. There were many that you cataloged that had complete runs or that had partially completed runs. And those were all labors of love, where I was simply trying to fill gaps, and you would do this through the hunt. And the hunt would be bookshops, overseas and local, across the country, across the province. It would be garage sales, it would be flea markets, it would be the publishers themselves of those particular books that I would approach and say, do you still happen to have, lying in the back room gathering dust, issue number 57 of such and such a periodical? Because that was the gap that I was missing in order to complete a run. It's more than a lifelong challenge to try and complete any periodical run, especially if it's an older one. Because where are we going to find these missing gems?
Yeah.
Where are they hiding? In whose basement? In whose attic? And how do I know that that person has it? And how do they even know they have it? And that was all part of the hunt. So as the butterfly continued to flit from flower to flower, trying to complete his runs, along came 2 poets who then began to fulfill my role, my collecting role as a miner, meaning wanting to drill deep. And those 2 poets are at opposite ends of the emotional spectrum for me.
Okay.
One is very cerebral, the other is very visceral.
Okay.
And the cerebral poet is P.K. Page, whom I did an honors paper on when I was at university in my undergraduate degree. She was the one who I mentioned to you I ended up actually visiting and acquiring a portion of her library. I also acquired a portion of the library of the visceral poet, who is Susan Musgrave. on the other end of the spectrum. And both of these voices, both of these poetic voices speak to me loudly. One sort of caresses my brain activity, the other one caresses my heart activity. And both brilliant writers, and I think I even mentioned this to you, Susan Musgrave is the only Canadian writer I know of who has not worked outside of her writing. She has earned her living through writing, and that to me is absolutely incredible that one could do such a thing. Her first book was published when she was 19.
Cool.
And it was at a time when she was actually in a psychiatric hospital in Victoria, in Ward 0, if you can believe it. That was the number of the ward.
Do you know what that means?
I have no idea, but it suited her perfectly. She would say that herself. And being a teenager, she got to know a few of the literary luminaries in Victoria at the time. And she even babysat for one in particular, who was a fellow named Robin Skelton. Robin Skelton founded the Malahat Review, which to this day is still one of the longest lasting and most credible literary periodicals going. And he visited her in Ward 0 and read some of her poems and uttered the wonderful words to her saying, "You're not mad, you're a poet." And those words of encouragement led to him being instrumental in her getting her first volume of poetry called Songs of the Sea Witch, published by Sononis Press in Victoria. So that to me is my sort of evolution as a collector. Today, what am I? Am I more a miner or am I more a butterfly? I don't know. I vacillate between the two. I end up doing things that make me want to drill deep into finding even more esoteric things about P.K. Page's writing, finding a postcard poem of hers, which would be a piece of ephemera today as a collector, versus saying, who else would I like to introduce into my life where I can drill deep?
So I'm going to interrupt you because obviously you're packing up your library.
Yes.
You're becoming a minimalist, but you still seem to have this collecting impulse. Or maybe not the collecting impulse, but there's clearly a searching within you. How do you reconcile that with your future plans?
With difficulty.
Yeah.
Our son and his family, one of the two boys lives in Creston, in the interior. And we recently visited, and there was a new bookshop in town. And Linda said to me, well, and I said, you don't have to ask me anything, I'm going in. And I walked into this bookshop that was on the main street, and it was evident that the inventory was from an established business, rather than someone who had just gone to 3 garage sales, gathered up stuff and shoved them on shelves. And as it turned out, the owners had taken over a bookshop from Sydney, BC, the Beacon Bookshop, it's called, and acquired all of their stock, found that it was too expensive to continue running the bookshop in Sydney, and relocated to Creston, where the rents were a lot more affordable, but the way they had everything displayed in that shop was just a gem of an experience, because a lot of used bookshops, going in, it just hurts the brain, because nothing is where you expect it to be. Nothing is organized, even with a minimal amount of organization. So yeah, I will still go into bookshops. I don't buy anymore.
No.
Because of my newfound apprenticeship as a minimalist. It has to apply to all aspects of my life, not just the furniture in my home. So it's been difficult because it's gone through an evolution of feelings and processes, but I've done this right alongside my progression towards being more minimalist at the same time, because there was a point, I would say about 6 years ago, when I first started thinking of divesting myself of the library, thinking that I had something that was of value monetarily, and therefore where could I get the biggest bang for my buck?
I see.
And that then evolved into, you know what, I'll be quite happy if I just got a tax credit from a post-secondary institution perhaps, or some charity where they could take the entire library and issue me with a very valuable tax credit that I could use in an upcoming tax return filing. That then eventually evolved to me saying, are you ready to donate? Are you ready to not only let go, but to give away carte blanche? And I finally have reached that point through a lot of emotional upheaval, but I'm finally at peace with the decision. And Rolf Mora at the People's Co-op bookstore is now the new proprietor of the collection. But that's how I got there.
When did you start collecting?
That started when I did my honors paper on PK Page in university, and that would have been in my last year, so I'm thinking 71, 72 at the university.
And she was, could you say that she was kind of what started, or like her writing is what started the collecting, or were there other impulses?
Not so much her writing per se, because obviously I loved it to write an honors paper about her and her writing. But what started the collecting was I went to look for these books, and all of a sudden I ran into terms such as first edition, limited edition, no longer in circulation, and all of these phrases and terminologies were new to me because I hadn't been a collector up until that point. And I found it hard as hell finding these out-of-print books of hers. That was the beginning of the hunt, the search, and the eventual discovery of gems in sometimes in the most unusual places.
That's cool, because that means you weren't... I always think it's interesting because, to your point earlier, some people collect because, they're mining for something. They want to go deep and they want to have a complete set of something. And I feel it's a very different motivation, when you collect in that sense, because that means you could collect any manner of things, right? Like you could be collecting... like bottles of sand. You could be collecting,
souvenir
different
teaspoons.
Exactly. So I think it's very interesting that you were more searching for, maybe you didn't know exactly what you were searching for, but you were searching for a little bit more of a connection with this writer that you already admired, and it turned into clearly like a life work.
And also, it turned into more than just one writer.
Yeah.
It turned into the canon of Can Lit in a way. And there are some sort of definitive edges to the collection. I'm not at all interested in what are called the Confederation poets in Canada. People like Charles G.D. Roberts, Duncan Campbell Scott, and all of these very... they all had a very strong colonial aspect to their lives and their work, and they wrote in very structured verse form. One foot was always on the other side of the Atlantic in good old Blighty and all of that. Canada had yet to establish or even begin to create an identity for itself in terms of what was really truly Canadian literature. And even to this day, people would argue, well, there is no definitive Canadian literature, which I think, frankly, is a good thing, because that gives the opportunity for individual writers to shine. And if you're as successful as Margaret Atwood or Michael Ondaatje, two Canadian writers who have now become incredibly famous and in the process reasonably wealthy as a result of their work being turned into films and other media as well. But they don't necessarily mean, they're not necessarily representative of Canada's best writers, in my view. I don't know if I should say this publicly, but I can't think of a worse reader of their poetry than Margaret Atwood. I will leave it at that. She bores me to tears when she reads, because there's such a horribly empty, echoey tone to her voice. Enough said. Enough said.
Well, actually, it is interesting though that you mentioned Atwood and Ondaatje, because I also think another interesting part of the library that we've gone through is precisely because you have works from, you know, dating back to, I think, either the 30s or 40s all the way to today, because, you know, you don't just have old stuff, we have things from like the 2010s.
Yeah.
And what I found particularly interesting, especially in parallel with your own life, is seeing the evolution of the writers themselves. You know, like there's, I don't remember the particular publications, but you can see Margaret Atwood's name in some really small zines, you know, dating
Yes.
way back. And then you really see the evolution of her work or her popularity as well.
Yeah.
Because as I'm cataloging, I don't even have time to read people's work. I mostly just take pictures so I can look later. What I find interesting is you see that they progressively end up in, I suppose, like more established publications,
Yes.
and those publications persist to this day versus the zines, you know, that are no longer around. What do you?
Absolutely true. Because I think I've actually said this to you during the past 2 weeks, where the reason, well, one of the big reasons I love little magazines is this is where every writer starts. Mm-hmm. This is where they first get a foothold into the writing community and to gain or to garner the attention of publishers. If a publisher is now being approached, you've submitted a manuscript to them, and they want to not only judge you based on the merit of what they've received, but what preceded this. Mm-hmm. They can then turn to these little mags and go, oh yeah, I see. This is when you appeared here in this issue, in that here. And to me, that is, it's finding people before they become known. Mm-hmm. And I like that aspect of collecting.
Yeah. Okay, and I know this breaks it up a little bit, but because you've just already talked about so many people, and oh right, yes. So I looked up who the top poets in your poetry collection are. So you've already mentioned P.K. Page and Susan Musgrave. I'd love to hear a bit more about them, just because I find them very. I don't know why. Every time I saw P.K. Page's name, I got so excited, and I'd never read anything by her, but you just made her sound so interesting. So you could talk about them. And obviously Susan Musgrave just sounds like she was just a very cool woman. But interestingly, you have a lot of Bill Bissett, and I also love all of the Bill Bissett stuff that I've seen. You have, so Bill Bissett's your number one. You have Patrick Lane, Irving Layton, Joe Rosenblatt, and Robin Skelton. And after that, you have George Bowering. So I'm not sure if you wanted to talk about any of them. I know you also brought some stuff by Norm. So it's really up to you who you want to talk about. You can talk about all of them. Yeah.
I think I'd love to. One of the things that I don't know if, how do I start this? I mentioned to you that I founded a poetry reading series called Poets Corner. That started off in New Westminster. I then relocated the series to Massey Books in Chinatown. And it was, I thought, quite successful. We ran readings once a month. And in terms of my criteria that I used to invite poets, I tried to blend emerging with established poets. I did not only want to be throwing out the higher profile poets. I wanted to pay homage to those who were up and coming and who showed great promise in their style of writing. Even before they were even published, I would have certain poets there. That, how did I know what they were producing? Well, we had an open mic segment to every reading. And there were people, quite often regulars, who would stand up there and read one poem of theirs from a little scratchy notebook or off their iPhone or whatever. And so I heard through some of those readings, people, and I thought, boy, this is good. This is talented. And the next thing, they are being published. And I did offer a helping hand in certain instances because I'd had some established relationships with little presses or indie publications, literary publications, I should add, both in BC as well as in other parts of Canada. So I got to know some of the poets who came to read at our series. And through them, certain friendships developed, some of them casual, some of them long-standing, and to this day still intact. And I've always cherished that, because if I can make a blanket statement about Canadian poets, the one common denominator to all of them is they are so accessible. They've never once came at me saying, who are you? That I must lower myself to, or condescend to speak with you. None of them had that attitude, not one. The one that intimidated me most was P.K. Page, because she had a reputation for not suffering fools gladly. I knew that going in.
It's the tarot card that you selected for yourself.
Exactly. And I spent an afternoon, including lunch, in her wonderful home in Oak Bay, just outside of Victoria. And it goes down as one of the most memorable and most unforgettable days of my life. Not only was I going to be acquiring a portion of her library, not free, I had to pay. We agreed on a price and she was happy with that. The only mistake I made, and this is a wonderful little anecdote, when I wrote the check, I was so nervous, I post-dated it by about 6 months. So by the time I came back to Vancouver, I got this very interesting email from her saying, I don't know if this was intentional or not, but the check was not current dated, and I only wish I can live to the point where I can indeed cash this check. I was mortified. I was absolutely mortified. So I quickly express posted a check to her and said, just destroy the first one. But that day spent with her, I think I've mentioned this to you before. She is my cerebral poet, and she is also, or she was, a socialite. Married to a person who was first editor of Maclean's magazine, and this was Arthur Irwin, who then ran the National Film Board in Ottawa. That's where they actually met. Oh. And it was Arthur's second marriage. His first wife had died, and they met in the early 50s, and a romance blossomed, and soon that led to marriage. But Arthur's life after the NFB was as a diplomat, and he was Canada's High Commissioner to Australia, and also he was the consul for Mexico, Guatemala, and one more, Brazil, which meant that he was physically in those countries, and P.K. Page was there with him. So she lived a life of high tea and cucumber sandwiches. And so that in itself also worked at creating some of an intimidation factor for me. So when I was over there, it was very, I was being very careful. Every word I uttered to her, I had to weigh up 100 times before I said anything. But she was most concerned about how I would react to Arthur, who was in his 90s at that point and in the throes of dementia. And she was afraid that it may create some embarrassing moments, etc., as we sat over lunch. But what I found was the common ground for us to really begin talking earnestly, sincerely, and without any affectation, was the fact that my mother was in a care facility at the same time with dementia. And so that was the common thread for the discussion and the dialogue for the rest of the afternoon. And you could just see the relief drain out of her face when I began to say to her, look, I understand completely, and when it comes to someone saying something they just said 30 seconds ago, you roll with those punches and you just answer the same way rather than saying, you just said that. Well, I've just told you that, which are all of the wrong reasons or the wrong things to say to someone who's grappling with dementia. So my day with PK was wonderful. Bill Bissett, a completely different kettle of fish. Bill will go down in Canadian literature history as an icon because of his prolific output, because he wrote phonetically. There was no punctuation, there was no capitalization. The word "the" was always spelled "th", and thoughts were "thots." Oh. And all of his output, was written in that vein. But Bill was Peter Pan. Bill was a child who was in an adult body. And whenever we would speak, and say, "Hi, James, are you raging? Are you raging today, James?" And he would use this lingo, and everyone he spoke to, his peers, anyone that he was talking to about getting a book published, that is how they remember him. That's how I remember him. And there is a line from Leonard Cohen's Suzanne where he says, "She brings me tea and oranges all the way from China." I don't know if you remember that line, but I remember fondly sitting in Bill's apartment in the West End, and what is he serving? He's serving tea and oranges. And he gives me a little going away gift, which is this tiny little leather drawstring pouch, and inside it are 5 beaded green frogs with little beady red eyes. I still have it somewhere in my little box of mementos.
Yeah, you're keeping that.
Yes, that I am.
Good.
And but Bill also published so many writers under the Blue Ointment Press imprint, and everyone from even Margaret Atwood all the way through to the least known Canadian poet was published by Bill. So he was as much a force for others in the CanLit field as he was a writer in his own capabilities, you know?
Yeah, I think there's like a photo, there's one edition of Blue Ointment Press that has like pictures of people over it, and I think you're the one who showed me Michael Ondaatje.
Oh, it was a collage cover.
Yeah, it was the collage
That's right.
cover.
Yeah, it's one of, I think it was the Occupation issue.
Maybe,
Which he also did the periodical. Not only was he publishing books, like Fiddlehead published books, but Fiddlehead also was a periodical, as was Blue Ointment Press. And so the pieces, and I think you helped yourself to a few of them.
I did, yes.
The oversized, honking big layouts of anthologies where he would have every poet from east to west included. And he would put the stuff out. What mattered more to Bill was getting it done rather than getting it done well. And that symbolizes all of the stuff that he published over the years and over the decades. Susan Musgrave, on the other hand, is a very different person. I think I would actually be bold enough to say that she is today quite eccentric. She's lived a very, very colorful life. You have P.K. Page, the socialite, cucumber sandwiches person on that end of the spectrum, and you have Susan Musgrave, who is attracted to bad boys in her life on the other end of the spectrum, where she was first married to a criminal lawyer who was defending, I think, 5 people who were charged with attempting to smuggle $30 million worth of marijuana into Canada. As she went and attended some of the hearings, she gazed over at one of the one of the charged people and fell in love with him. And when he was acquitted, ran off to points beyond with him. That was, what year would that be? I'm thinking early 80s, approximately. When that marriage ended, she was on her own for a while, but then as writer in residence at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, she received a manuscript on her desk. It was entitled, the working title was Jackrabbit Parole. And it was written by a person by the name of Stephen Reed. When she inquired as to who he was and where he was, she found that he was in jail. Bad boys. And he had sent this manuscript that she thought was quite brilliant and was instrumental in getting it published. Stephen Reed was one of 3 convicted felons who were part of the stopwatch gang. They would knock off banks, both in Canada and in the US. And they all used a stopwatch. They had to be out of there within that certain very limited period of time. And so when I first met Susan, I went over to, she has 2 dwellings, one outside of Sydney on the island, in a place called the Treehouse. And it's called that for a very obvious reason, because there is a huge Douglas fir that is growing in the middle of the house, and the house was built around the tree. Her humor is dark. She could easily be classed as a stand-up comic. She is that funny. Very, very self-effacing in her humor. But she also has residence on Haida Gwaii, just outside of Masset, where she runs the Copper Beach B&B. And so she spends time at both abodes. When I went into her kitchen, I'll tell you in a second why I was there. When I went into her kitchen, I don't know if you know those old mincing machines where you would, through a C-clamp, attach a manual crank to your kitchen table, and you would take stewing beef, perhaps, pour it in the top, and you'd crank the handle, and it would create hamburger.
Yeah.
There it was in the kitchen, on the edge of the kitchen table, but instead of it being used for its obvious purpose, she had a bunch of tiny little plastic human figures that were all crammed in the top of the mincing machine. That was among many other weird and wacky and wonderful things that were in the house.
Why was she doing that?
It's all part of her expression.
Okay.
Very much so. She became renowned in Victoria as the crazy lady with the art car, because her entire vehicle was festooned with little things that she had glued on. I don't know if it'll take too long for me to find that photo, but if you Googled Susan Musgrave art car,
Okay.
There's a photograph of her behind the wheel. And the whole side of the car is just covered with magnetic things and
cool.
stuff that she's glued on.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
But those are just some of the snippets and excerpts of these wonderful writers that I've had an opportunity to engage with and to come to know. Joe Rosenblatt, he's on your list. He was living I met him not that soon before he died, and I'm trying to think of the year, I can't remember. I'm going to guess at 2019, somewhere around there. But again, just such an interesting writer who, like many poets, are artists as well as writers. That should be a thesis for someone. Why are there so many great Canadian poets who also turn to visual art? P.K. Page, Bill Bissett, Joe Rosenblatt, the list goes on, of Patrick Lane. I showed you some of his very dark, dreamlike pen and ink drawings. All of these great writers also turned to visual art as a creatively expressive outlet for themselves. But Joe, very scratchy little pen and ink drawings. What disappointed me was that I offered to help him get his papers and all of his manuscripts launched with an academic institution like SFU. So I approached Special Collections at SFU, told them about Joe, who had been living in BC since the early 80s, if not earlier, but he grew up in Toronto. And their answer to me was, well, he's really a Toronto poet when he had already been living longer in BC than he had in Ontario. And I thought, what a shitty answer. What an elitist, sort of nonsensical answer. And so I then said to Joe, why don't you go back to the Thomas Fisher Library, which is affiliated with the University of Toronto, where he had some of his early papers already sent to. Go back to them and just get them to add whatever you've produced since, added to the extant collection of what they have. So all of these experiences with these poets have been so enjoyable. I've enjoyed every one of them. I can't say that about some of the bookshop owners that I've encountered along the way. Some of them have just been absolutely bloody miserable. Just horrible people. But anyway, the writers were far more interesting than those selling their wares.
I want to give you time to read some of the poems, but I guess in the last question that I have for you really is looking, especially because you've had the chance to organize your collection chronologically, alphabetically, so that I can catalog everything. What has anything surprised you in going through your collection, and I guess what do you hope for the future of your literature?
That is a question that I'm still processing right now. I know that Rolf at People's Co-op has told me in no uncertain terms that his priority in terms of acquiring my entire collection are the non-Canlit books, which are all very sellable, especially online. And as I may have mentioned earlier, my original intention was to, after retiring from corporate work, was to be an online bookseller. And therefore, I felt Canlit, of and by itself, was not going to keep me rolling in money. We all know that. But I also started acquiring books that I felt were really, really sellable. Mm-hmm. The more unusual, the more wacky, the better. Mm-hmm. Because I know that on eBay, on abebooks.com, there is a market for those kinds of collectibles. So Rolf did say that the candlelit was going to be a second priority. What I've been processing in the meantime is, and I have yet to talk to him about this, is to approach him and say, I will help you sell the candlelit. Mm-hmm. Because I know it better than you, and it will give me some measure of satisfaction that my first dream, which has since changed, I won't say dashed, changed, I can still dabble in that one. So that is the intent.
And do you ever think about who would be what kind of people would be buying? Do you think it would be other collectors, other poets?
Other collectors in particular, like my friend Tom Woods, who is very much a miner, not a butterfly in his collecting. He has very specific authors that he pursues in terms of the libraries that he is building of those writers. But he is also a writer. He's both... he writes both fiction and poetry, and he's damn good too, even though he's turned to it very late in life. He's done most of his writing since he retired. He was a provincial court judge, and since retiring from the bench about 2 years ago, his writing is now really accelerating, his own creative writing. And I cherish speaking with people like him because we talk candlelit. Mm-hmm. And those people for me are few and far between because I haven't developed any relationships with other collectors. I don't know who they are. I don't know where they are. But I certainly know who the publishers are of the literature. I certainly know where the poets and other writers are. But to talk to others who have done what I've done, they are harder to find. And therefore, when I have people like Tom come into my life, I cherish that very much. And we go to, what's the coffee shop on the drive?
Mojo.
Not Padre.
Prado?
Prado, thank you. Prado. We go and hang out at Prado and eat our scones and sip our coffee and chat about all things candlelit.
Yeah, I think it's a very good way to kind of bookend our conversation, because I do feel like the collector figure is very shadowy, right? Like the collectors, I mean, we know who you are. Mm-hmm. And we're very lucky to be able to, get some, unfortunately not all of your stories and anecdotes, but, I think the idea of the tarot is that it brings to light, the shadow. And I think by going through the cards, which are the books, we're actually bringing the shadow. We're able to see you and then, hopefully maybe connect with maybe other people.
There is still the possibility of things happening for me in this activity in the future. But as you know, right now the direction is to be a global slow mad.
The direction is Panama, I think.
4 months in Panama coming up starting next month, and followed by at least 2 to 3 months in Malaysia, and so on and so on. After we spent 3 months in Albania, Linda and I. But if you will permit me, I would love to read
yes, absolutely.
one poem from both ends of my emotional spectrum, the cerebral end and the visceral end, if I may. I mentioned that I have this almost dichotomy of poetic interests, that I have P.K. Page, who for me is a very cerebral poet on one hand, and I have Susan Musgrave, a very visceral poet, in my opinion, on the other. And I wanted to just share one poem from each of them. I'll start with Pages, and it won't take much of a preamble to introduce it. It's a very short poem, but I think it really reflects my great love for her cerebral talent. The poem is called Stefan. Stefan, aged 11, looked at the baby and said, "When he thinks, it must be pure thought because he hasn't any words yet." And we, proud parents, admiring friends who had looked at the baby, looked at the baby again. Beautifully succinct, but she captures something that a child has given this beautiful gem of an idea to an adult that has caused that adult to now go, geez, you've got something there. I'm going to look at this child and just process what the 11-year-old kid said, that it cannot have any thoughts, any word. Sorry, I'm getting all confused here. It must be pure thought because he hasn't any words yet, with the inference that words are very confining to the whole mental process. The other end of the spectrum, with Susan Musgrave, I want to give a little bit of a preamble. This is a poem that she has written it says it's for Bill. And Bill, in this case, is probably was one of Canada's most renowned can-lit booksellers. William Hoffer operated out of many different locations in Vancouver. He was I don't know if he even graduated from SFU. He may have been kicked out. Would not have been surprised. Bill is an iconoclast. I say it in the present tense, forgetting that he has gone. But I found that Bill was someone that knew more than anyone else on the whole subject of can-lit than I had ever come across. But Bill was very much the Don Cherry of Canadian literature. He did not like P.K. Page. He did not suffer fools gladly. He would either like you or not like you, and you knew exactly how he felt about you. But even more than that, even if he liked you, he would quite often find a reason not to like you in the end. So he was irascible, he was a curmudgeon, he was, but yet underneath all of those gruff and horribly negative character traits, there was a genuine, generous soul of a person who cared. He cared about Canadian literature, and the way in which he cared was to criticize the Canada Council for funding writers who had not an ounce of talent in his opinion, and who then still ended up siphoning money from the government, as he would put it. But anyway, Bill was a heavy smoker. The shops that he had always reeked of cigarette smoke, and he eventually succumbed to lung cancer. He went home to Victoria, which is where his parents lived, essentially to die. And Susan Musgrave was a friend of Bill's. She managed to stay a friend for a much longer period of time than most. I was friends with Bill because I learned the best way to stay on his good side was never to express a contentious opinion in his presence. That's how I remained in his good books. But anyway, as Bill was dying, Susan, who's also from Victoria, wrote this wonderful, wonderful poem. It's called The Situation in Which We Are Both Amateurs. I came to you last night and we tried to talk. How you were beginning to consider the virtues of death. How dying would be just like you. We should consider your absence, your gift. You held your breath, trying not to cough. There I go, having symptoms in front of you, while we sat in the wind-raked garden where the patio door kept banging open, and almost shut. Neither of us got up, unable to admit it distracted us from the situation in which we were both terrible amateurs. You said, "I've had a pretty good life for a guy like me. Growing up at all was a bloody miracle." You said, "Please don't be unhappy about me." And the door banged shut. It grabs me. It grabs me viscerally, and I just find a lot of her writing is like this. Poignant, raw, filled with emotion that is so hard to capture with words. And I think she's done it better than most Canadian poets. Here is the Malahat Review, and I ended up in my collection with many duplicates simply because when I would acquire a portion of a writer's library, there would be issues that end up duplicating because 2 or 3 writers would have received the same issue of that particular magazine. And that led to me having multiple copies of many of the items. But I ended up with extensive runs of this particular wonderful periodical, and I've picked up issue number 50. So if you look at it, this is a pretty big, how often was it published back then? I think quarterly. To put out a periodical, a magazine that is this extensive on a quarterly basis, mind you, it was a special edition. It was their 50th. And looking through this, look who's there, P.K. Page. Oh God, Margaret Atwood. Okay, I know I can read Margaret Atwood's poems better than she can.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of, I'm not too far.
This magazine, Eyes, it's pronounced Eyes, not Is,
Okay.
was a very important Toronto-based periodical. And in it, we've got lots of people. And again, P.K. Page. Isn't that beautiful? Well, I tell you what, why didn't I read another P.K. Page since the first one was so short? This one is called Advent. Do you want me to read it?
Sure.
And it's for Penny. And I think I know which person that would be. Quote, "A voice speaks in my person. Who hears? Do all my neighbors' ears pressed to my flesh know what my ears cannot? Long deafness blinds, makes mute. I lie entombed. A voice speaks in my person, a seed without a ruin. Green shoots break up granite. The horns of the bull are crescent. The goddess with her axe moves molten through my person." That's very sort of kaleidoscope, psychedelic kinds of imagery for me. But again, unlike Susan Musgrave, it's not, for me, visceral. It plays with my brain, or my brain plays with it, as an example.